Around 6:30 a.m. on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese carriers 230 miles north of Oahu, Hawaii, launched 183 planes in the air to begin what we now know as the attack on Pearl Harbor. It took the planes about an hour and a half to reach their first intended target, which was Wheeler Field, where they began at 7:51, firing on aircraft, hangars, and buildings there at the field. The famous Japanese pilot Mitsuo Fuchida radioed to his superiors, "Tora, Tora, Tora," meaning that they had accomplished their achieved aim of surprise for the American forces. Then at 7:55 a.m., the Japanese air raid reached Pearl Harbor, where the goal was to destroy the American fleet, which obviously these events led to the United States entering into World War II. Now, you might know about Pearl Harbor in general, but what you might not know is that before the attack on Pearl Harbor began, some 50 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor began, that there were two young Army privates at their radio station, and they spotted a large blip on the radar. Their names are Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott. And just after 7 a.m., spotting this large blip, Mr. Lockhart, Private Lockhart, concluded that this must be a large grouping of planes. In later years, Private Lockhart recalled, "It was larger than anything I had ever seen on radar before. I knew that something wasn't right. I just didn't know what." And so he notified his superiors of what he was concluding that he was seeing, but unfortunately, his warnings were ignored. History doesn't tell us much of what happened from around 7:20 a.m. when he notified his superiors to around 7:50 a.m. We know a little, but not a lot. The United States was in the waning moments of peace, just seconds away from one of the worst disasters and losses of life in U.S. naval military history. And that was the moment. Those were the moments just before it began. That's exactly what Revelation chapter 15 is. It's the moment just before it begins. And what is the it that I'm talking about? Revelation 15 moves further into the darkest days of humanity, where we will witness the moments just before the outpouring of God's wrath and God's judgment from the seven bowls on the earth. Dr. Randall Smith describes Revelation chapter 15 in this way. He says, "It's the story of judgment and wrath hanging in the air above the physical universe. This is a glimpse into the throne room before the final rush of God's judgment and God's complete and total victory over mutinous humanity. It isn't the story of destruction that will come. It is the story of the moment just before the deluge." Revelation 15 is about the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of the outpouring of God's wrath on the earth. Thousands of years of pressure has been built up by the enormous weight of the original sin committed in the Garden of Eden. The pressure is soon to be relieved in this chapter by the explosion of the dominating and all-consuming power and force of God's wrath. And at last, God is on the edge of demolishing all the institutions that sin has built in defiance to his name and to his holiness. So, why is this recorded? Why do we have record of the moments just before God pours out his wrath? And should believers feel a sense of joy? Those who follow God, should they have a sense of excitement that God is finally getting even, that he is finally about to judge all that has gone wrong? Well, I don't think that's the point. But one thing that we can know for certain is that Revelation 15 is the beginning of the exclamation point for just how much God hates sin. God hates sin the same way that the child of an alcoholic hates alcohol. God hates sin because it killed the joy of the union that he created between mankind and himself. It killed the joy that he intended and the unity that he intended with humanity and with all of creation. God hates sin because it required the death of his son to bring us back into a right relationship with himself. And through Revelation 15, we can see that God's wrath is poured out on that which separated us from himself. And one glorious day, after the events of Revelation in total are past, we will live forever in unity with him. Revelation 21:5 says this, "He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making all things new.' Then he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'"